Hugh Despenser, Hereford, England, November 24th, 1926. The man is dragged into the square bare-skinned, his flesh scored by rope burns, the crown upon his head nothing but a ring of nettles pressing barbs deep into his scalp. Dark scripture scrawled in ink, mixed with pig's blood, runs in crooked lines down his chest, each word splitting under the tremor of his breath. The air stinks the musk of unwashed bodies, the copper tang of blood, and beneath it all, the sweet, heavy rot of something kept alive too long. Steam rises from his lips, each exhale breaking into a shuddering groan that vanishes in the roar of the crowd. Boots crunch on frozen mud as the spectators surge forward, drawn to him as if to a feast. Somewhere, a lute plucks a single, mocking note, too soft to be accidental. The rope at his neck pulls taut, his body jerks, feet scraping for purchase on the slick ground. It slackens again, granting not mercy but more time for the mob to savor his unraveling. A fire waits nearby, its smoke twisting into the low sky, and beside it, a blade blackened from the forge, still radiating heat. He blinks against the cold, eyes red-rimmed, the pupils narrowing at the sight of what is to come. In them is not only the raw panic of a man on the edge of death, but the glint of something deeper, a truth too dangerous to be spoken, a sin the court will never record. Around him, the noise swells jeers, curses, and the hollow beat of drums. The crowd will watch him die, but to understand why, we must go back to the echoing halls where his rise began, to the moment his voice first bent the ear of a king. The winter sun slanted through the tall, arched windows of Westminster like pale blades, slicing the dust-filled air. The light caught on the cold gleam of spears by the double doors as they swung open, and the muffled murmur of the great hall fell into silence. Hugh Despenser stepped inside. No crown, no sword yet. He walked as if the ground itself yielded to him. The fur at his collar brushed against his jaw with every measured step, his eyes sweeping the room like a predator searching for the smallest flicker of weakness. The assembled nobles shifted uneasily, some bowing their heads, others refusing even that. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but here the air was still, heavy with the smell of tallow smoke and damp wool. At the far end, King Edward II sat slouched in his chair, the faintest smile touching his lips, as if this business were a mere formality. The king's gaze wandered, settling on nothing for long, a tapestry of St. George, the flames in the hearth, the hands of his companion. Hugh moved toward him, the soft thud of his boots sounding far louder than it should have in the silence. He reached the dais, leaned in slightly, and murmured something the hall could not hear. Edward's eyes brightened, his shoulders eased. The king's hand, moments ago, idle on the armrest, tapped once in faint approval. Hugh turned, his gaze falling upon the first petitioner, waiting in the shadows of the chamber, a merchant, clutching a rolled parchment in nervous fingers. Approached the steps. He bowed, words tumbling out about trade rights and shipments. Edward began to nod, but Hugh's slow shake of the head stilled him. The merchant faltered. The parchment remained unopened. The guards moved forward. At the edges of the hall, courtiers exchanged quick glances, the kind that vanish before they can be noticed. They had all seen this before a whispered word, a flicker of disapproval in Hugh's eyes, and fortunes were made or broken. Lord Berkeley waited further back, the petition in his hands already damp from the heat of his palms. He had been here before, months ago, standing in this same place, ignored then as now. Hugh's glance brushed over him like a shadow. Edward's gaze followed, then slid away. Berkeley tightened his grip, feeling the stiff parchment bend, and forced his face into stillness. The session dragged on. Requests for land grants, military commissions, marriage approvals all passing not through the king, but through the man at his side. When Hugh approved, his assent was almost imperceptible, a tilt of the head, the faintest movement of his fingers. When he refused, the air seemed to grow colder around the petitioner, the very silence turning against them by the time the final name was called. The hall was nearly empty. Lord Berkeley had not moved. The king rose, Hugh at his shoulder. The scrape of their chairs on stone echoed down the length of the room. They walked together toward the inner corridors, their steps falling into perfect rhythm. Guards closed the doors behind them, shutting out the draft, leaving the hall in darkness save for the few candles still guttering in their holders. In the privy chamber, the world outside seemed far away. The air was warmer here, scented with beeswax and the faint tang of spiced wine. Edward had discarded his mantle and was crouched over a small wooden table. Upon it sat a delicate model, a windmill carved from pale oak, the gears and vanes meticulously shaped. His face lit up at Hugh's approach. "Look," the king said, his voice almost boyish. "They sent it from Flanders. The gearing is ingenious. Think of the grain we could mill." Hugh took the model, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers. He turned it slowly, watching the gears turn. "Think," he said softly, "of the lands we could control if every mill was ours." The king's expression shifted not to suspicion, but to thought, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked past the toy to something only Hugh was placing before him. Later, they dined alone in a smaller chamber, the firelight painting gold across the silver platters. Roasted capon, rich with herbs, stewed prunes and thick syrup, a flagon of Gascon wine that caught the fire's glow in deep crimson. Outside, in the torchlit courtyard, a cluster of merchants waited with petitions of their own. They would wait all night if needed. Some would pay for entry, others for refusal. All would pay Hugh. Between bites, Edward spoke of hunting trips, of drainage works, of the comfort of well-kept grounds. Hugh listened, smiled in the right places, refilled the king's cup. He spoke little of his own, his words were saved for when they could take root. This was how power was kept, not by the hand that wielded the sword, but by the voice that decided when it was drawn. Beyond the palace walls, snow was beginning to fall, muting the noise of the streets, hiding the filth in the gutters. In the market, people spoke his name in lowered tones, their breath hanging in the cold air, some with envy, others with resentment, all with the same undercurrent, a sense that no one man should have such reach. Inside, Hugh stood behind the king's chair, one hand resting lightly on its carved back. In the flicker of the fire, his face was unreadable. He could not feel the cold beyond the walls, could not hear the slow, steady beat of unrest growing in the streets, and he could not yet see the day when that same beat would thunder against the palace gates. The year had turned, and with it, the damp. Raw cold of early spring settled over London, rain slicked the cobbles, pooling in the uneven stones, and the city stank of wet timber, smoke, and horse dung inside the treasury chamber. However, the air was thick not with weather, but with coin. Chests stood open, their contents stacked in neat. Gleaming columns, rolls of parchment lay unfurled across the table, ink still wet on fresh decrees. At the head of it all, Hugh Despenser bent over the accounts, one finger tracing the curling script, the other hand tapping the edge of a coffer as if listening for a heartbeat. Beside him, the clerk waited in silence. The figures were not in dispute. They were Hugh's own. Each mark, each pound had been spoken for a levy here, a tariff there, the rents of confiscated estates streaming steadily toward a destination no one dared name aloud. The sound of coins shifting under Hugh's hand was the sound of power being measured, weighed, and pocketed. A knock came at the door. The merchant William Deepole entered, his hat clutched before him, his boots leaving faint damp prints on the floor. He bowed low, words rehearsed, voice taut with the effort of appearing calm. He spoke of wool shipments bound for Flanders, of permits already paid for in good faith. Hugh listened, eyes steady, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, betraying that he already knew the details and the outcome. "You'll need a new license," Hugh said at last. The syllables crisp, 500 marks, and 10% of your profit. Upon delivery, the merchant's face tightened. "The fee is 20 marks by law," he said carefully, as though speaking to the king himself. Hugh's gaze did not waver. "The law is what the crown says it is," he murmured. "And I speak for the crown?" The silence that followed was long enough for the dripping of rain from the eaves to become unbearable. Then Hugh nodded toward the guards. Heavy hands closed on the merchant's shoulders. The petition slipped from his grasp and landed on the floor, where the ink bled into the damp wood. By nightfall, William D. Pole would be in the tower's lower cells, and his family would find themselves negotiating not for trade rights, but for his release at a cost twice what Hugh had named. In the days that followed, the same scene repeated in different forms. Nobles summoned to court found themselves waiting for hours in the drafty antechamber, their fine cloaks smelling faintly of the smoke from the guards' torches, when at last they were admitted. They stood not before the king, but before the man who stood at his side. Hugh's questions were short, his eyes quick, and his refusals absolute. Lord Berkeley's turn came again. His petition, a matter of boundary rights, had been delayed for 6 months. He stepped forward when called, the parchment already warm in his grasp from his own clenched hands. He began to speak, but Hugh raised a single finger. The hall went still. Hugh leaned toward Edward, lips moving in a whisper no one else could hear. The king's eyes slid from Berkeley to the opposite wall, and the moment passed. The parchment was never opened. The atmosphere within Westminster began to change. Conversations grew quieter when Hugh entered the room. Eyes dropped more quickly. Servants, once bold enough to gossip at the edge of the corridors, now stepped aside entirely, backs pressed to the stone. He moved among them like a shadow cast by something unseen and tangible, but inescapable. Even the Queen felt it. There were moments, fleeting and unspoken, when Isabella's gaze would meet Hugh's across the great hall. Her face remained composed, but there was a hardness there, as if she were memorizing the shape of his expression for a day to come. Hugh's eyes would linger a fraction too long, his smile unreadable, before turning back to the king with some new suggestion about revenues, tariffs, or the reassignment of lands. And the lands kept coming, estates seized under suspicion of disloyalty, incomes redirected under the guise of royal necessity. A manor in Suffolk passed into Hugh's hands after its owner was found guilty of neglecting his levy. In the Welsh marches, entire villages were reassigned to his control, their rents delivered not to the crown, but to his own stewards. At night, in the quiet of his private chambers, Hugh would sit with the day's tallies before him. The scratch of the quill was the only sound, steady and deliberate, as numbers became ink and ink became possession. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, carrying with it the distant rumble of the river. He would pause, listening, not to the Thames, but to the echo of footsteps in the corridor, the ever-present hum of a palace where nothing moved without his notice. By spring's end, the court had shifted on its axis. Decisions no longer seemed to come from the throne, but from the figure standing beside it, and though the streets beyond Westminster teemed with life markets, taverns, churches full to bursting in the minds of those who mattered, there was only one man they truly feared. They did not yet know that fear would be the last thing holding his name aloft, and when it failed, it would fail all at once. The winter of 1324 hung low over Westminster, the light outside the palace a dull, pewter haze inside. The air was warmer but heavy, carrying the scents of damp wool, beeswax, and the faint spice of clove from the fires. Queen Isabella walked the length of the great gallery, the train of her gown whispering over the stone floor. The soft echo of her footsteps filled the space between the hollow thud of her heartbeat. She knew even before the messenger appeared that Hugh Despenser's hand was in what was coming. By midday, the first blow had fallen. Her chamberlain burst in, pale and breathless, to tell her that 28 of her estates had been seized. The list was read aloud, each name a wound: Hereford, Kenilworth, Pleshy, lands she had walked, lands she had governed, the income, the tenants, the dignity that came with them all gone with a stroke of the pen. The messenger's voice faltered as he reached the end, but Isabella stood very still, her spine straight, her fingers locked at her sides. She did not give Hugh the satisfaction of tears. The next day, the night raids began. Steel-shod boots thundered in the private corridors as her household was torn apart, one by one. The people she trusted vanished into the cold dark her physician dragged away before dawn, his satchel of herbs spilling across the flagstones, her confessor taken mid-prayer, the governess who had sung her children to sleep pulled from her bed without a candle to light her way. The sound of their protests muffled. Disbelieving lingered long after the doors had slammed shut. By the week's end, The most brutal cut was delivered: Isabella's children. Young John and little Eleanor were taken from her chambers under guard. She was allowed to dress them herself that morning, her hands fumbling at the laces of their cloaks, her eyes fixed on their faces as if trying to memorize them, when the guards led them away. The echo of their smaller footsteps was almost worse than the silence that followed. They were placed under the care of Eleanor de Clare, Hugh's wife. Isabella would see them only once a month, always under watch. Life within the palace became a theater of humiliation. At the Christmas feast that year, the hall glittered with gold plate and candlelight, music swelling from the galleries. Edward sat in his place at the high table, Hugh beside him, their chairs elevated so that all could see them. Isabella, the Queen of England, was seated far below, alongside lesser officers of the household. From where she sat, she could see the gleam of the king's goblet, could hear his laughter carried above the music, but between them stretched a gulf as wide as exile. Servants passed her by with the better cuts of meat, the richer wines, to lay them instead before the men who had orchestrated her fall. In the privacy of her apartments, she let the mask slip. There were nights when she stood alone by the tall windows, the glass cold against her palm, watching the mist rise from the Thames. The wind off the river carried the smell of wet stone and smoke. She thought of her children's faces, of the silence of her deserted halls, of the slow tightening of the noose Hugh had thrown around her life. Her letters to France grew more urgent. The words pressed hard into the parchment. I am a queen without power, a mother without children, a wife without the protection of her husband. The days stretched, each one a mirror of the last. Hugh's shadow fell over every council, every audience. He was there when Edward granted favors, there when he revoked them. He was there when Isabella entered the hall, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction longer than necessary, a silent assertion that he had placed her exactly where he wanted her. And yet, beneath the surface, something cold and deliberate was forming in her. The public indignities, the private griefs, the calculated isolation, all of it was shaping her into something Hugh could not see. In the quiet hours, she began to think not of survival, but of return. For now, the palace walls held her in place, their stones unmoved by her fury. But the same wind that rattled the windows at night was moving far beyond Westminster across the sea, toward allies who still remembered her not as a prisoner in silks, but as a daughter of France. She would wait, she would watch, and one day, the man who had stolen her children, her lands, her crown's dignity, would find that the woman he had tried to silence had been listening all along. The year 1321 broke with the hard crack of frost along the Thames and a court in uproar. Pressure from the barons had finally forced the king's hand, and Hugh Despenser was ordered into exile. The decree was read aloud in the great hall, the voice of the herald echoing against the stone. Edward sat stiffly on his throne, lips pressed into a pale line, while Hugh stood beside him, motionless, the faintest trace of a smile frozen on his face. There were no tears. No pleas, only the sharp turn of his heel as he left the chamber, boots striking the flagstones in an unbroken rhythm. London watched him go. The air was bitter with wood smoke, the sky the color of tarnished silver, and the streets slick with winter mud. Merchants leaned from their stalls to see him pass, guards closing in behind him, the king's colors stripped from his retinue. Beyond the city gates, the wind off the channel tasted of salt and something colder, the edge of opportunity. Weeks later, the name Hugh Despenser began to drift back across the water, carried not by envoys, but by terrified merchants, in the harbors of Brittany and Normandy. English wool ships were found gutted, their holds emptied of cloth, their crews stripped and cast adrift in open boats. Witnesses spoke of a flag bearing no crest, only a strip of black cloth snapping in the wind, and a figure at the rail whose bearing was unmistakable. Hugh had not disappeared. He had changed the theater of his power. The Channel Islands became his refuge, their cliffs rising sheer from the sea like the walls of a fortress. From there, his ships prowled the narrow waters between England and France. At night, in the taverns of St. Peter Port, men whispered of his methods, how he waited for the tide to turn against his prey, how his sails would appear without warning against the moonlit horizon. He chose his targets with precision ships belonging to political enemies, merchants who had cheered his downfall, even foreign traders who had once spurned his terms in court. One March night, the mist lay thick over the water, swallowing the glow of the stars. A Genoese carrack, heavy with wine casks, crept northward toward the Thames. Its crew moved slowly, their breath ghosting in the lantern light. From the fog, a shape emerged, leaner, faster, its bow cutting the water with predatory ease. Hooks bit into the Genoese hull, ropes hissed over the rail. The first scream was cut short by the thud of a belaying pin. When the sun rose, the carrack was gone, replaced by the low silhouette of a Despenser vessel already turning toward the islands. The hold was swollen with plunder, Gascon wine, silver plate, and bolts of fine wool, all to be sold under the table to buyers who asked no questions. In the months that followed, the raids mounted, 16 ships in less than a season, 60,000 pounds in goods, vanishing into the coffers of a man officially banished from the realm. It was not chaos, it was ledgered, calculated, recorded in the same precise hand that had once signed royal decrees. But the sea, for all its wealth, was never a sanctuary from politics. When word reached London that Hugh had attacked a Genoese vessel, it came not as rumor, but as a formal protest from the Doge himself. Genoa threatened retaliation blockades, seizures, perhaps war, and yet, in the royal chambers, Edward did not condemn him. The king's envoys spoke in vague terms of misunderstandings at sea. In private, the truth was simpler. The gold flowing from Hugh's raids was already feeding the treasury for the day he would return. On Guernsey, Hugh stood at the cliff's edge one evening, the wind tearing at his cloak, the Atlantic swell hammering the rocks below. Behind him, the village bustled with the quiet efficiency of his new dominion, ships being refitted under tarred canvas. Barrels rolled into warehouses, scribes tallying the spoils. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the crash of the surf. He watched the horizon as if it were a door, waiting to open. When at last the summons came, it was not in the form of a pardon, but a plea. England was restless. Edward needed his most trusted man. Hugh sailed back across the channel under a sky the color of molten lead, the sea lifting his ship like the breath of something vast and unseen. The spray was cold on his face, but his eyes were fixed on the east, toward the white cliffs that were no longer a barrier but an invitation. In the harbor at Dover, the flags flew again at his approach, and the guards saluted as if no exile had ever been spoken. By the time his boots struck the stones of Westminster once more, the great hall seemed smaller, the air warmer, the voices quieter. Hugh Despenser had returned, and the sea had taught him that power taken by force was sweeter, and far more dangerous, than any gift a king could bestow. The spring of 1322 brought Hugh Despenser back to the heart of power, and with it came a sharpened edge to his ambition. The court at Westminster hummed with the soft rustle of parchment and the low murmur of petitioners. Yet the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Hugh no longer needed the king's ear to be heard. His presence was enough to tilt the balance of every conversation, every judgment. His return was not a quiet restoration, but an opening move in a campaign of acquisition unlike anything England had seen. Lands, titles, and incomes began to shift as if drawn toward him by invisible threads. It started with the Lady Barrett, a widow of standing whose estates rolled green to the horizon, summoned to London under the shadow of a charge for treason. She stood in the council chamber beneath the watchful gaze of Hugh himself. The light from the tall windows fell across her face, pale but unbowed. Hugh's questions were not shouted. They slid like knives between her defenses. By dusk, she was led away to confinement by winter's first frost. Her lands were signed over, and 6 months later, she was dead, her house shuttered, her gardens choked with weeds. From there, the pattern deepened. Disputes over inheritance became traps. The Gloucester holdings, once split among the sisters of Hugh's wife, were prized apart and reassembled in his favor. Debts were conjured from ink and seal, then called in with a ruthlessness that left halls empty and hearths cold. In Wales, his reach became a shadow over the hills. The air there smelled of rain and heather, the the roads slick under the hooves of his men. 41 castles and manors, stone towers and timber keeps alike shifted into his control. Some came through papers signed in trembling hands, others through the blunt language of force. Villagers stood in the mud outside their gates, watching new banners climb the poles, the cloth snapping in the wind. The fields still yielded grain, the flocks still moved across the hills, but the rents no longer flowed to lords they had known for generations. Even the corridors of the palace seemed to contract around him. Edward leaned more heavily on his counsel, eyes seeking Hugh's before rendering judgment. Those who once approached the king directly now diverted their path, turning instead toward the man at his right hand. And Hugh, for all his polished manners, had grown colder. His eyes lingered a fraction too long on those he meant to unseat. His hands, once quick to gesture, now rested still, as though the decision was made before the first word was spoken. Whispers followed him, not just of greed, but of something darker. In taverns beyond the city walls, they spoke of the bond between Hugh and the king, voices dropping as they named it. In the great houses, the rumors traveled more softly, yet with sharper edge, unnatural. They said, a disorder in the realm itself. No one could prove it, but the accusation was poison enough, seeping into the cracks of his reputation. Hugh did not flinch. If the streets muttered, the coffers still filled, from £500 a year in his early service. His income now swelled to 12,000 a tide of silver and gold that seemed unstoppable. But the weight of that tide pressed on the kingdom itself. Over 200 lesser lords found themselves dispossessed, their banners pulled from the rafters, their names fading from the rolls. 300 families, some noble, many not, were broken, their lands consumed in the maw of Hugh's design. At night, in the great hall of Westminster, the firelight traced the sharp lines of his face as he stood beside the king's chair. Outside, the city lay dark under the watch of the moon, its narrow lanes thick with the smell of smoke and river silt. Within, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the slow turning of parchment in the king's hand. Hugh's shadow stretched long across the tiled floor, reaching almost to the doors as if even the stones themselves were bending toward him. What Hugh could not see, or would not see, was that shadows grow longest when the sun begins to fall. The summer of 1326 brought with it a heat that pressed down on London like a hand, trapping the smells of the river and the markets in the narrow streets. In the great chambers of Westminster, the air was no cooler. Thick with the breath of men arguing over what none dared name aloud, the Queen had vanished from court, and she was not coming back alone. Rumors moved faster than couriers. They said Isabella was in France, her silks traded for armor, her words sharpened into promises for any man willing to march beside her. They said Roger Mortimer rode at her side, the king's prisoner turned her ally, and perhaps more. And through every whisper ran the same unspoken thread: Hugh Despenser had made this happen. Hugh heard the news in the Privy Council, standing at the king's right hand as always. Edward's fingers clenched the arm of his chair, the knuckles white, his jaw working behind tight lips. Hugh leaned down, speaking low so the others could not hear, his voice a steady trickle meant to shape the king's fear into action. But the words could not cool the heat in the room. It was the heat of something approaching, something neither of them could stop. By September, the first ships were sighted off the Suffolk coast, lanterns bobbing in the early dawn haze, sails swelling with the wind off the channel. The invasion came not as a single blow, but as a tide men-at-arms splashing ashore, banners unfurling wet in the morning light, the clang of steel as they formed ranks. Town criers shouted warnings in the marketplaces, their voices breaking with urgency. The people closed their shutters and waited. Hugh rode with Edward northward. The roads churned to dust under the hooves of their horses. Villages stared as they passed, not with loyalty, not even with fear, but with a kind of watchful calculation, as if deciding which way the wind was turning. At night, in the camp, the fires cast long shadows on the canvas walls, and the murmurs of the men carried through the dark. They spoke of Isabella's army growing, of Mortimer's skill in battle, of defections. Every rumor was a thread in the net drawing tighter. When they reached the Welsh border, the news was worse. Garrison after garrison had opened its gates to the Queen without a fight. Lords who had sworn to Edward now rode under her colors. Hugh paced the length of the king's tent, the candlelight catching the sharp angles of his face. He spoke of counterattacks, of burning bridges behind them, of holding ground in the marches where his own castle stood. Edward listened, but his eyes darted to the entrance at every sound, as though expecting betrayal to step through the flap. By late October, they were running, not marching running. The court in flight was a ragged thing, carts piled with chests of coin, half-packed trunks of silver plate, the king's own bed dismantled and lashed to a wagon. Rain turned the roads to sucking mud. The wheels groaned under the weight. Hugh rode close to Edward, head bent against the weather, cloak heavy with water, behind them. The Queen's forces closed the distance with each passing day. They reached the gates of Caerphilly Castle under a sky the color of slate. The portcullis groaned upward, the chain clattering, and the king rode inside with his companion. But the walls that had seemed so high in Hugh's mind now felt smaller, the stone colder. Supplies would not last forever, and there were too many inside whose loyalties could shift before the siege was even laid. The end came not with a storming of the gates, but with a betrayal within. Hugh was taken at Neath. Pulled from the saddle by hands he recognized men who had once bowed to him in the king's hall. The air smelled of wet leather and horses, the ground cold and slick beneath his knees as they bound his hands. Edward was led away in silence, the rain beating on his hair. From that moment, every mile was a descent, through sodden fields, through towns where people lined the roads not to cheer but to watch, their faces unreadable in the gray light. The clink of the chains at his wrists became the measure of the days. In Hereford, the streets narrowed and the noise began shouts, jeers, the drumbeat of feet on the cobbles. Above it all, somewhere in the press of the crowd, the high, clear voice of a woman's laughter. Isabella had returned, and she had brought the reckoning with her. The morning of November 24th, 1326 broke cold and colorless over Hereford. Frost clung to the edges of the timbered roofs, and the breath of the crowd rose in pale plumes against the sky. The square was a living wall of bodies, pressed close, their voices a low, restless growl that rose and fell with each movement near the scaffold. Hugh Despenser was brought forward, the chains at his wrists clinking in the muffled stillness. His hair had been shorn, his face hollowed by weeks of captivity, across his bare shoulders. The skin was scored and raw where rope and iron had bitten deep. He did not stumble, but the stiffness of his gait betrayed the cold in his limbs. The scaffold was no simple gallows. It was a stage every timber, every instrument arranged for the eyes of the thousands gathered. The smell of pitch from the torches mixed with the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood. And beneath it all, the sour undertone of fear. From a balcony draped in velvet, Isabella watched, her goblet catching the thin light. Her face was still, the wine in her hand steady, as if this were a play she had waited years to see performed. The sentence was carried out with deliberate cruelty. He was dragged through the mud, the jeers of the crowd swelling as his body jolted over the cobbles, raised just high enough on the rope for the breath to tear in his chest. He was cut down again, left gasping in the cold air. A knife, its blade dark from the forge, gleamed for an instant before it descended. The rest came slowly, methodically, the fire, the blade, the final stroke that sent his head tumbling to the straw. The crowd surged forward to see, the roar rising like a wave breaking against stone. Pieces of him were claimed not for remembrance, but for warning. His head was carried toward London, his limbs sent to the corners of the realm, nailed in place above gates where the wind could strip them clean. By nightfall, the square was empty, save for the scaffold and the dark stains in the dirt. The air was colder now, the frost already creeping back across the ground, somewhere in the silence. A banner snapped in the wind, its cloth stiff with ice. Hugh Despenser's shadow had once stretched across the whole of England. Now it was scattered to the edges of the kingdom, a reminder not just of his fall, but of how swiftly the tide can turn when power rests on nothing but fear.